Good afternoon and welcome to World Building and Collaboration with author Jeanne Adams, sponsored by the Carroll County chapter of the Maryland Writers Association and hosted by Carroll County Public Library. Before we introduce Jeanne, I'd like to introduce the library team. I'm Dorothy Stoltz, Director for Community Engagement. We have with us today Lisa Picker, who is the Communications Director, and she will be our behind-the-scenes tech producer. And we also have Dottie Wolf, who is representing the Finksburg branch. Lisa and I will be monitoring the questions and comments. Next slide, please. If you are joining us by Zoom, please type in your questions and comments into the Q&A. So if you hover your cursor at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the symbol Q&A. And when you open that up, you'll get a screen. You can type in your question, comment right there. We're going to pause midway and then also at the end, check in for your questions. Also, if you're joining us today by Facebook, please feel free to use the Facebook chat for your questions. And just to let everybody know, we are recording today's program and it will be posted to the library's YouTube page. So now I'd like to introduce Kelly Phillips, who will introduce our special guest speaker today. Kelly is president of the Carroll County chapter of the Maryland Writers Association. And Kelly had the wonderful idea to invite Jeanne Adams to be our presenter today. So let's please welcome Kelly Phillips.
Thank you, Dorothy. Hello, everyone. As Dorothy said, I am Kelly Phillips. I'm the president of the Carroll County chapter of the Maryland Writers Association. And Jeanne Adams has been one of our frequent speakers at our meetings, and I am thrilled to welcome her back here today. Jeanne writes award-winning books in several genres, including romantic suspense, paranormal romantic suspense, urban fantasy, and space adventure that's been compared to Jack McDevitt and Robert Heinlein. If you've attended her popular Body Disposal for Writers workshop, you know that she knows all about getting rid of the bodies and hiding the evidence. Jeanne is both traditionally and indie published and has been featured in Cosmopolitan magazine. In addition to teaching this class and her body disposal primer, she also teaches plotting for pantsers, as well as how to write a fight scene with her pal Nancy Northcott. You can find her on the web at www.jeanneadams.com and on most social media. Her books are available in both paper and ebook through Amazon, iBooks, and Nook. Welcome, Jeanne.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for letting me come back to hang out with all the folks in Carroll County again. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to present this class because I've done a lot of collaborating, mostly because I was left unsupervised with other writers. And so I ended up saying, well, why don't we do this? Ooh, that would be fun. And then you're end up in an anthology or a collaboration. One of the very first things I thought about when I started thinking about teaching this class, I've done it in person, so switching it over to online, I kept thinking, what's a good quote that I could put up? And this is one I found that I really, really like. It's collaboration is not about gluing together existing egos. It's about ideas that never existed until after everybody entered the room. And it always reminds me of Ed Catmull's book, Creativity, Inc. And he talks about the creativity that happens when you get a bunch of writers in the room at Pixar and how you shut the door and then everything starts to get creative and ideas fly and all that sort of thing. I've never had that experience of having a writer's room and a screening situation, but I certainly have had the fun of sitting down with another author and going, hey, how about let's create a space station? And having the ideas fly all over the place and end up becoming books. So I wanted to start with collaboration first, and because there's some things you need to think about before you even go into world building if you're going to do it with another person. So I figured I'd talk about collaboration first, After we're done with that section, we'll stop for questions and answers, and then we'll talk a little bit about world building. So a few words about collaboration. It can be the most wonderful experience you've ever had as a writer. It can also be horrible, it can be devastating, and it can be the best thing ever. The horrible and devastating come when you don't think things through. So that's part of what we're going to talk about today. So to give you some examples of collaborations that I've done so that you can be thinking about ways in which you might want to collaborate with another writer, with a friend, with, you know, a screenwriter. My friend Nancy Northcott and I equally co-created this shared world of Outcast Station. It's a fictional, obviously, planet and space station well into the future, and it is completely fictional. We have the 2 books in the series, Welcome to Outcast Station and Christmas on Outcast Station. They are 2 concurrent novellas. My story is on the space station. Her story is on the planet around which the space station spins. Same thing with Christmas on Outcast Station, 2 concurrent novellas. We both did short stories for Predators and Petticoats, which is an interesting anthology. And then we will do standalone novels. That's sort of in the plan. So another way I collaborated was Nancy and I get into this collaboration thing. We created the setup, which was the inaugural ball of the first woman president. And a homegrown white supremacist terrorist group doesn't want her to take office. So this particular suspense novel, which is no longer available, it's out of print, had a real world setting in the sense that it was Washington, D.C. at an inaugural ball. However, the hotel we set it in was completely fictional. And each of us took a part. I wrote the prologue. I wrote a story. Nancy wrote a story. Sue Farrell wrote a story. And JD Tyler wrote a story. If y'all are not familiar with their works, they are wonderful suspense authors. But the way this worked was it was meant to be read as a novel so that you didn't see it was seamless between authors. It should have been seamless and read as a novel. It was an exciting project to do. There were some challenges with this, though. So some of the challenges that I speak about will be referencing this, some will be referencing other things, but this ended up being such a great experience that it taught me a lot about how to set up Outcast Station and a lot of how to set up another project we did, which was Christmas at Canham Castle. Again, Nancy and I created the world. We like to do that. And once you find a partner in crime that will help you create worlds, it's fun to go back to that well. We created a fictional town in Wales. It's actually in England on the Welsh Marches. And we created the castle, we created magic and the shared experience of a Christmas ball at Canham Castle. In the first one, there were 7 authors. The stories are all different. One is historical, one is 2 or 3 are paranormal, one is a straight contemporary, one is a romantic suspense. This year, we're doing Trick or Treat at Canham Castle. That will be out at the end of this month. And 4 authors were able to do that one. We went back to the world we'd created, to this castle. You should see the maps we had to draw. Oh boy. But that shared world has been so much fun that we're already planning out several more adventures at Canham Castle. Another one, of course, is I wrote a novel called The Witch's Walk. And a number of people, having read the book, decided they would like to play in that world. So I've done anthologies, now all of them are now out of print, where people came to play in my world. I set the rules. I created the characters that were the mainstays of the town. And then other people created stories within that framework. So when you talk and think about ways to collaborate, one of the first and easiest for you as kind of getting your feet wet, if you want to see if you even like this idea, is to get some folks together or join in with or find an anthology that's around a holiday or around a theme. I did one called Under the Kissing Bough. I put one of my Haven Harbor stories in that one. The only requirement in that story, didn't matter where you were in time, you could be in ancient Rome, you could be in the far future, it didn't matter. The only thing you had to do was have mistletoe in the story. So that is a wonderful way to begin a collaborative effort to see if you even like writing to a theme or if you even like the process of going in with other authors and doing this sort of thing. Many of you may have seen 1001 Dark Nights. This is a sort of Scheherazade themed set where a variety of authors with a variety of, some of them are straight thriller writers, some of them are romantic suspense, a couple of them are erotica, but all of them have this theme of 1001 Dark Nights a la Scheherazade. You could pick any theme, vampires, werewolves, space adventures, but this is one way to start a collaborative effort that is not as touchy-feely or as difficult as writing in a shared world, to see if you even like it. So, ways to see if you even like writing to theme. There are a lot of places that you can find open submission anthologies that present a theme. One recently that I submitted to was Michael Ventrella, Cross the Universe. It had to include the Beatles. That's all. That was the only requirement. I ended up using a Beatles song, and that was not the direction they wanted to go, so I didn't end up in that anthology. But the group Zombies Needs Brains, they post on Facebook a lot. They have open submission calls for various and sundry themed anthologies. Michael Ventrella also on Facebook, you can find him. He periodically does calls for themed anthologies, as does Daniel Ackley McPhail, Nicole Givens Kurtz. She recently put out an anthology called Slay, which was S-L-A-Y, not E-I-G-H, which was about vampires, I believe. Also the organizations, mystery writers, horror writers, thriller writers, they all have annual anthologies. Romance Writers has done it, but they are currently in such turmoil that they are not doing one this year. Horror Writers a couple of years ago had R.L. Stine edit the anthology. So those are some great places to look and see if you want to start trying to think about writing to theme. They're often open submissions. Things like Zombies Need Brains is a crowdfunded, and they do slush entries. So they have some authors that anchor the anthology. Rod Belcher, Jody Lynn Nye, Misty Lackey, and then they take slush entries. So if you're stuck in your writing in any way, these kind of short story submission things can get you writing to deadline and also get you writing again if you're stuck. Themed anthologies work really great when you don't have an idea that you really want to focus on. If you need to write, you want to write, you're done with a project, you've finished a project, and you've got that sort of gap feeling, a themed anthology can be a great way to sort of keep you in the groove. Nancy again and I, we're notorious for collaborating, but we have a friend named Karen Crane, and she wasn't sure she wanted to do that anthology thing. So we decided we would just do one with DNA as the theme and put it out at Father's Day, and it's called Who's Your Daddy? And each of the stories are different. But again, just like the Mistletoe book, this one had one unifying theme. Every story had to have something to do with DNA. Either a DNA test that reveals something that you didn't think it would reveal, or well, two of them are suspense and one of them is contemporary. So other ways to collaborate. Write in an established world. Now you can do this as fan fiction. Sometimes things like Dark Tides Rising, John Ringo writes a series that is a post-apocalyptic zombie universe, zombie apocalypse universe. I generally do not like those books, but I have to give John Ringo serious props because it's superb. It's logical. It's one of the only zombie apocalypse books I've ever even tried to read that makes scary sense. Well, a lot of people felt that way too, and there began to be a lot of fan fiction around his first book, which is called Under the Graveyard Sky. That fan fiction got so prolific that he decided to do an open call and produce Voices of the Fall and several other anthologies that write in that world. And you can find a lot of those if you like his books or like an author's books. You can find out on their website usually if they're going to let people play in their world. Same thing with Eric Flint's 1632 series. This is a science fiction series which is set in obviously 1632 with an alteration to history. There have been a number of authors who co-wrote books with Eric Flint in this world. Most of the time, he doesn't let people write in his world. He co-writes a book with them set in that world. That way he maintains control over the things that he came up with and that he wants to reserve. Now, you can co-write in the same world as Nancy and I did in Outcast Station. So you can write an established world, somebody else's world. You can co-write in the same world that you've both created, which Nancy and I have done. You can co-write in the same world with the same story, with one voice, which is Outstretched Shadow. Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory wrote this together. It doesn't trade off. It is literally written as a novel, and it is one of the best examples of collaboration I've ever read because it is seamless in its flow of, you don't ever know which author is writing. There's not a difference in voice. But they did a separate, on the cover, it's definitely separate that they're two different authors. Now, another way to collaborate is as an author. So there are two authors, Donna and Bree, and I can't remember their last names, but they write as Kit Roca. And again, this is another fabulous example. Awesome collaborative book with two writers writing seamlessly as if they were one person. Ilona Andrews also does this. She and her husband, Gordon, Ilona and Gordon Andrews, they write as Ilona Andrews. They write together, and their writing together is seamless. You never hear one voice or the other. So those are some ways you can collaborate. Then you want to ask yourself if you should and why you want to. So perhaps you're an author who's created a world, and people like John Ringo or James Patterson or Janet Ivanovich, where you write in a niche market and you want to help other authors bootstrap their way to being good, successful writers. People like James Patterson and Janet Ivanovich frequently do this. They bring another author in to co-write a book with them and help them bootstrap their way into their own contracts, which is really great, and it's giving back, and it's fabulous. If you are aware of, it's Mastermind, I think, it's a website where you can go on and learn from people who do this. James Patterson teaches a class in it and gives the opportunity, when you take his class, to write a short that then could potentially be a book that he co-writes with you. Some people want to give back as an editor. I mentioned R.L. Stine. Rod Belcher's done this. Chuck Gannon in the science fiction world has done this. Nora Roberts has done it in the romance world. Sylvia Day has done it as an editor for one of the Romance Writers of America edit anthologies. So that's one way you as an author might collaborate in terms of being the anchor author for a themed anthology, for instance. You might decide that you just hit the New York Times bestseller list and you want to help a friend bring up her writing chops. And so you decide to do another story co-written with them and bring them into. Now, as I mentioned before, you might decide to collaborate on a shared audience. Why would you want to do that? Because it's fun, but also if you're a historical author, let's say you write historical set in the colonial era, and you have an audience, let's say you have 5,000 book sales, and that's really great, but you would really like 10 or 20,000 book sales, and wouldn't we all, right? You might decide to get 2 or 3 other people who write in colonial times and create a holiday themed anthology. Because then what happens if somebody from your audience reads the story in the anthology from author 2 and likes author 2, then they'll go buy author 2's books. If author 3's favorite reader reads your story, they may go buy your entire backlist. Holiday theme anthologies don't make money usually in and of themselves. What they do is give you a nice long tail of people buying your backlist. So the why of a holiday themed anthology and or collaboration is to mix and merge audiences and gain book sales. You can build a shared audience across timelines, set it all in Rome. You can build across elements like the mistletoe book. You can build it off, we're all set in colonial times. Doesn't matter if it's suspense, doesn't matter if it's set it around a time frame. And the why of it, again, is because you want to build audience and share audience in that respect. You could do mystery or magic with shared themes and ideas. You can do timelines. Then there's the collaboration like Nancy and I did, where you have a great idea that only works when you play with another author. In my case, Nancy and I were sitting at a conference and she said, I've always wanted to write a space opera. And I looked at her and said, I've always wanted to write one too. We should do it together. And so we ended up building this massive world. And we did a lot of work, and we'll talk about that more in the world building section, to make sure we had covered all the bases before we ran into them. So what's good about collaborating? Well, one of the things that's really great about collaborating is if you have 7 other people depending on you, you're going to make your deadline. It's embarrassing and awful to disappoint the people that you're in an anthology with by being late. So it'll get you to meet your deadline. Obviously, as I said before, one of the biggest things is sales. With an anthology, you're cross-pollinating your readership. In the Christmas at Caneham Castle, people who like Ceresia Glass's work are probably going to like mine. People who like mine are probably going to like Ceresia's or Gail Martin's or Morgan Bryce's. So somebody who likes suspense is going to like Nancy Northcott. Somebody who likes historicals is going to like Donna McMeans. So those people cross-pollinate, and that's going to give you sales. It's a wonderful, wonderful way to build your readership. You do get better at writing. If you have somebody telling you, you have to be done by this deadline and it has to have this theme and you have to do this thing, it makes you more creative. It just does. I don't know why, it just does. Writing with a partner can challenge you to stretch your boundaries beyond what you already know. I take a lot of classes. I like to teach them, as you can tell, but I also take a lot of classes because I always want to try to improve my craft. I want to become a better writer. And I can say unequivocally that one of the things that has most improved my writing is writing collaboratively with Nancy and Gail and Ceresia and all these other people that I wrote collaboratively with. That is a very hard word to say. You also will work with ideas you might not have otherwise considered. The short story I wrote for Michael Ventrella and Across the Universe was based, to me, this was a random idea for me. Something about the Beatles. That is not something in my everyday writing life I think about doing. I tend to be thinking about suspense and thrillers and blood on the pavement and magic and space. And suddenly I thought, well, you know what? This is a great exercise. I was a little stuck in some of the things that I was doing. So I thought, I'll just give this a shot. It was wonderful for kickstarting where I was and getting me unstuck. And it was an idea that I would not ever have considered using otherwise. So that's some of the good stuff about collaboration. Let's talk about some of the stuff that is a red flag. If you're talking at a writing group and somebody says, or you're at your writers meeting at Maryland Writers Association, this would never happen there, but you've gone to a conference and people are saying, I'd really like to collaborate with somebody. Well, one of the biggest red flags, and all of you as authors, I know, are going to be nodding your heads at this. You have somebody who comes up to you and says, oh, I heard you want to collaborate. I have this great idea. How about I tell you my idea? And you write the book and we'll split the profits. Or how about you and I write this book together and you front all the money because you're a successful author. And then we split the profits 50-50. That is a huge waving red flag. Do not go there ever, ever, ever. You have a potential partner that's very set on the way the collaboration will go. It's going to be this way or we're not doing it. Well, that's not a collaboration. That's somebody saying, do you want to play in my world? If you do, that's fine, but understand that that is not a collaboration. You have a potential partner that you're going to write a suspense series, and they say, okay, as a partner, I'm telling you, I will not be in an anthology with you if there's sex or violence or language or Muppets or shifters in this collaboration. Well, that's not how a collaboration works. And so I've had the experience of people being very gung-ho about writing in a shared world or becoming part of an anthology. And they say, well, but I can't possibly be in something that has language in it. And, I write suspense novels. The bad guys don't say golly gee, they use expletives, and those are often quite colorful. And if you've got a potential partner who's going, yeah, I can't live with the language, then that's a mismatch. That's not going to work. More red flags. I have, unfortunately, not any of the ones I've shown, but unfortunately been in an anthology where 2 of the 6 people were considered the deadline more like guidelines, a la Pirates of the Caribbean. The book was supposed to be out July 1st. Somewhere around July 15th, they finally got their stories in. And when you're working with other authors, especially when one of them is the anchor author and has New York Times bestseller as their first name, there's not a lot you can do about that. But if you, as one of the authors, have already done your publicity saying the book is going to be out July 1, it kind of makes you look like an idiot if it's September 1 when the book comes out. So you want to be careful to not work with people who treat deadlines more like guidelines. It's often difficult to work with people if they're unwilling to promote. Now, I've worked with people where they said, I don't like Twitter, I don't like Facebook, but if you'll put together tweets or you'll put together a Facebook thing, I'll share it, I'll retweet it, just don't ask me to come up with it. That's totally fine. I'm totally cool with that. But if we've agreed up front that we're going to promote this book, and there are, like with the Mistletoe book, there were, I think, 12 or 13 authors in that. And there were 4 or 5 who were on it with publicity and tweeting and Facebooking and Instagramming and putting things up on Pinterest and all that sort of thing. And then there were some who just rode the coattails. They did not do anything. And that's kind of a red flag. It may not be that you can do anything about it in the moment, but you can know, I don't really want to collaborate with that person again because they're not willing to be on ball with me. Sometimes if you're working with a less experienced author, you run into a real difficulty of the product they produce is not up to standard, or they didn't either understand or meet the theme. And that can be a real challenge from the perspective of the person who's putting together the anthology, because you then are put in the position of saying, I'm so sorry, but we can't put this in the book because it's at level 5 and everybody else is at level 1, and it's going to stick out like a sore thumb, and it's actually going to do more harm than good for you as a writer. That's hard to say to somebody, and as an author, it's hard to get that that feedback, and it can end and ruin friendships. And I've had that experience too. Or you're working with somebody who's a control freak. The deadline is July 1. On June 1, they go, is the book done yet? On June 5, they go, is the book done yet? And I don't know about y'all, but I set my schedule up that if my deadline is July 1, the book will be done July 1. And I will send it to you July 1, but I'm not sending it to you June 1. So sometimes working with that kind of person can be really, really challenging. And it's something that is a red flag. Not sharing common viewpoint. I was in an anthology and ended up not taking out my story because the person who was putting together the anthology, we didn't share a common viewpoint. My viewpoint was that, people are generally good. I'm a glass half full, oh my gosh, it's not only half full, I have a glass optimist. She was very much a pessimist, and her partner in crime was the same. They were both very kind of negatively focused, and he was particularly sort of had that dismal undertone to things. And I don't mind that. I don't particularly read it because I am an optimist, but I discovered that they needed everything to sort of be more towards the world is ending and oh my Lord, it's horrible. And I'm just not that kind of a person, and my story would not have fit with the other people in the book. So not sharing that common viewpoint, again, if your story sticks out like a sore thumb in the book, if it's the best quality one and sticks out like a sore thumb because it's the best quality one, that's great for you, not so great for the other people. But if it sticks out like a sore thumb because it's off the tone of all the other stories, or it's just different than the other stories, that sometimes doesn't help you and can actually be bad for you as a writer and give you negative feedback and negative sales. So got to be careful with that, not sharing a common viewpoint thing. Now, the other thing is, if you get one of those people who are like, well, I'm going to put together the anthology and my name is going to be on the cover and nobody else's, just back away from that entirely. Now, the caveat that is, if you're in an anthology with big anchor authors, you know, Nora Roberts and Sylvia Day and James Patterson and JD Robb are all anchoring the anthology, and you manage to get a story in it, don't expect your name to be on the cover. It's going to be flashing lights with those big name authors. But if it's just another author, mid-list author you're with, and they don't want to put your name on the cover, don't walk, run. So let's say the collaboration is a go. You've got a shared love of the genre or topic that you're doing. You've got a shared love of the world you're going to build or you've built. You're going to put your ego on hold and say, okay, we're going to do this in the castle, and the castle can't have a firing cannon. Or you're going to stick to your guns and say, nope, it has to have a firing cannon. You've got that worked out. You want to make it the best it can be. You're ready to accept a change and suggestions that make the collaboration good. Nancy and I had a situation where I was making some of the law enforcement officers on Outcast Station a little shady. And she was like, well, since I'm writing this law enforcement officer and he's really great, could yours not be shady? It was not a big plot point for me, so that was easy to change. So I was able to and willing to accept a change and suggestion so that the collaboration stayed positive. You love your characters, you make each other better writers, like the Kit Roca and James Mallory example. So you got to have a collaboration agreement. I don't care how good of friends you are. I don't care if it's your best friend. I don't care if it's your sister. Have a collaboration agreement. Now, disclaimer here, I'm not a lawyer. I've never played one on TV or the internet. So this is not construed as legal advice. It's just, wow, we screwed this up at some points and this is what you need. So, collaboration agreement must-haves. Who owns what? In Outcast Station, Nancy and I co-own the world. Canham Castle, she and I own the world. Everybody else comes to play, but they each own their individual people that they created. So the copyright page of Canham Castle and Trick or Treat at Canham Castle is long. Who owns the people? Like in my Witches Walk series, I own the people. Someone can mention my sheriff or my mayor, but they can't put words in their mouth. That's the collaboration agreement I have if somebody wants to write in my Witches Walk world. Who has the rights to all of that stuff? For the Canham Castle and Outcast Station, Nancy and I co-own the rights to the shared world of the castle and the shared world, but I own all the rights to all of the maps of Canham Castle because I drew them. So there are different levels you have to decide on right up front before you even get started. For instance, with the Mistletoe box set, how long are you going to keep the story up, or how long are you going to keep it in an anthology before you take it down and it's yours to do with what you want? Make sure you know that up front. Make sure you decide that up front. So the Mistletoe example, that book went on sale on November 1st. It came off sale on December 31st. And from January 1st on, the story that we published in that set was mine to do with as I pleased. There was no restriction on it. But for those 2 months, it was exclusive to the box set. I did not publish it anywhere else as a single title, just in the box set. So that was really important because you're not then competing with your box set. And what happens then? Free and clear, you have all your rights back, et cetera, et cetera. In several of the anthologies we've been in the Christmas at Caneham Castle, we originally said we'll put it up for 6 months, but it was still selling in, would that have been April? And so, believe it or not, it was Christmas, but it was still selling in April. So we decided to leave it up, but we had, all 7 of us had to agree that that was the way we want to do it. If any one person would not have wanted to do that, then we would have just stopped. Again, who has controlling interest of the series? Who has the right to say, you can't do that? Or this sucks writing wise and it's not going in the book or anthology. It's not up to standard. For me, when I did anthologies using my Haven Harbor Witches Walk series, I obviously was the controlling interest saying, yeah, no, you can't do that. You can't do that in my world. With other anthologies I've been in, it's either the big name author or sometimes there's an editor involved, and the editor is the one that says, okay, X writer got their story in on time, but it's not up to par. And then that editor said, no, you can't do that. So you have to decide up front, though, who's going to be the bad guy, who's going to be the boss, and who's going to say, no, that's not in. Another thing you need to decide before you get involved are what are the upfront costs and who pays them. You obviously, before the book even goes on sale, sells 1 copy, you have to have a cover. You have to have editing and copy editing. And then, unless somebody in the group knows Vellum, you have to pay for formatting and somebody has to put the book up. And then from there, they have to be responsible for the accounting. This slide right here, these are the most, all the other stuff is important, but these are the ones that will end friendships and hurt you badly. If you don't know who's paying and you have everybody's agreement, if you've decided to share the costs on this, who's paying and how much, and who's the accountant, and how often is the accounting done? How often do you have the somebody sends you the numbers for payment? Let me check my, I've got to check my battery. He'll be right there. There, make sure my computer doesn't cut off, which it just did. Oh, sorry, there we go. I'm back on power now. I don't know how I was on battery, but I was. Okay, so these right here, these are the things that if you write nothing else down today, write this down. You got to have a collaboration agreement, and these are the things you need to work out in advance before anybody sets pen to paper. Okay, so some other things. What's the deadline? What's the absolute drop dead deadline that everybody has to have their stories to the person who's going to do the formatting? Period. End of discussion. Who's editing and copy editing? Most of the anthologies I've been in, the author has to turn in the story fully edited and copy edited before it's delivered. That makes each individual responsible for paying whoever they want to copy edit or edit before you deliver it. That's sometimes the cleanest way to do it. So then the editing or copy editing is bad. It's on the author. It's not on the anthology. The other thing you need to do, though, is whoever's reading for making sure everything fits in the world, like for Christmas at Caneham Castle and Trick or Treat at Caneham Castle, I was the continuity reader. And so I had to have agreement from all of the participating authors. If I see a typo, can I fix it? I'm not changing your story, but can I fix a typo? Because some people don't want you to touch their work, but you're sitting there going, oh my gosh, it says then instead of the, and copy editing didn't catch it. So that's just one of those little details that you may want to stick in your collaboration agreement. Who's doing promotion and how often? Now, all of us in the crazy world of self-publishing know that we are responsible for promoting our books. So if you've got 7 authors and we've all agreed to do promo, are we going to hire it out to a service and they'll do the promo for us and it'll cost each of us this much? Are we sharing that cost? Or are we all, like the mistletoe book, we were all supposed to do promotion starting, October 15th, going through November 1st, and we were supposed to try to do something every day, and that we had all agreed to that, and some people didn't do it. So there's pros and cons to both, but just so you know, there's always going to, especially if it's multi-author, there's always going to be someone who can't or doesn't do it. The problem comes if you decide you're going to use a service or whatever, and you've got 7 authors and one person wants to do it and all the people want to do it except for one. That becomes a real problem, because regardless, they're going to benefit from the promo, but they don't want to pay for it. That becomes a little difficult. So that's one of those ones you have to agree up front. You have to get those costs up front and decide how you're going to handle that. Okay, what's the deadline? Obviously. Who's in charge of uploading? How long do we want to keep it up before all the rights revert? And to whom does what intellectual property belong? This is something, again, not a lawyer, but the intellectual property is listed generally in the copyright section. For instance, in Christmas at Canham Castle, my hero for the Christmas story was the Earl of Canham. So he was the dude who owned the castle. It's a hotel, castle hotel. Well, that meant everybody at some point mentioned my character. So in the copyright section of Christmas at Canham Castle, it says, this character is the property of Jeanne Adams. Someone else created the events planner for the castle. That character became her intellectual property. So because we merged the world and weren't just writing to a theme, when you're writing to like the mistletoe theme, everything in your story stays your intellectual property, because mistletoe is not copyrightable. Everything is your intellectual property. So your copyright page is very simple. When you do a shared world, your copyright pages, especially with 6 other authors, it becomes quite complex if you're doing it where the stories merge and meld. For Christmas on Outcast Station, because Nancy and I literally completely share the entire world, the copyright page is easy again, because it's both of us. And for instance, in Christmas at Canham Castle, 2 of us own the world. Everybody else owns their intellectual property and their particular characters. So that copyright page becomes fairly complex. We got a lawyer and we all shared the cost of that. So again, these are things to think about. You could get your critique group could all of a sudden say, hey, let's do an anthology. Maybe you want to walk through some of these things before you say yes. Okay, so who's got a question about collaboration before we get to world building?
Thank you, Jeannie. This is wonderful so far. And
Thank you.
we've had a question just about the recording. So I just wanted to remind folks that it will be available through the library Facebook page. And within a day or so, we'll have it up on our YouTube page as well. But you could go to the library's Facebook page and find it there. And interestingly, early on, before you got to the part of how to set up agreements and contracts, we had somebody asking just about that. So you really have covered that very well, and how important it is to go beyond just a verbal agreement.
Yes. Yes.
And, I was thinking that, whether it's for anything that seems like highly collaborative or creative, something more than a verbal agreement would be helpful. And I remember seeing an interview of Peter, Paul, and Mary. Now, I don't know what they had as an agreement, but in terms of being creative together, you were talking about how helpful it is to have more than one, just yourself trying to create a story. They said that they had very distinct personalities, interests in life, philosophies of life. But when they performed together on stage, they became a much larger whole performance. And there was a lot of synergy there. And so that's what this is reminding me of, that you can write together and create something bigger than just your own individual writing.
Well, I think Pixar is one of the most amazing examples of this, because no one person writes a Pixar movie. It's an entire table of writers throwing ideas out. And none of those ideas in and of themselves stick. I was privileged to tour Pixar last year. And then also, like I said, reading Ed Catmull's book, which I'm sure y'all have in your collection. It's called Creativity, Inc. It's about the formation of Pixar, and it covers the term when Pixar became part of Disney, and well, Steve Jobs, and then part of Disney. But one of the fascinating things he shares, and I recommend it highly to anybody as a good read on creativity, is that process of, you know, taking Woody from being a marionette toy that was grumpy and more really like the prospector to the Woody he became, all happened at the writer table because of different input from different people. And that collaboration, I showed the cover of Misty Lackey's Outstretched Shadow series. I think there are 7 books in that series now. I've read Mercedes Lackey for years, and I've always liked her books, but I have reread that book time and time again, because not only because I love the story, but sometimes I've read it trying to figure out whose voice is whose, and I can't. They have done it so seamlessly, and they each have such distinct voices, because I've also read James Mallory's books, but when they are together, they are writing so seamlessly that it is as if they are, like Kit Rocha, one person. And the Kit Rocha book, I actually just finished. That came out in, that came out mid-September, I think. And I read it, I had it on order because I'd heard about it, because they're mercenary librarians. You'll appreciate that, Dorothy. The mercenary librarians, again, seamlessly written. You don't hear one author or another. It's as if they are one person. That is really hard to do. And so all these other ways of collaborating and world building tend to be a little easier to get started with. Nancy and I are going to try the writing as one person thing too, but we'll see how that goes. Tune in next year.
Yeah, absolutely. And it strikes me too, by collaborating, that afterwards, it's like you gain different skills or strengths through that process for your own writing too.
You really do. It's made me so much more aware of the angles of story to have written with these other people. You know, I went to a writing class one time, and they put up a big photograph on the slide screen. And it was Oak Alley, the big mansion in Louisiana with the driveway and the big overarching oaks and the big White House at the end. And there were about 20 of us in the room, and they gave us about 30 minutes, and we were all to write an opening to a story using this picture. Every single one of them was different. And it was amazing to think about and listen to these stories and all the perspectives of how that picture could be viewed. And it made my perspective of how to look at something like that completely different. And that's what collaborating often does.
That's great. That's great. Well, why don't we go on to part 2, world building?
All righty. Hopefully I'll spark some more questions for people. And please don't hesitate to ask questions. I don't mind answering them. And obviously, as you've seen, Dorothy and her team will make sure that they get to me, and we'll get them answered. I can suggest that you look at, for collaboration agreements, there are the Science Fiction Writers Association, it's sfwa.org, does have some examples coming on their website. Most organizations don't have templates, but SFWA is getting that up and running. And I think that those will probably be available whether you're a SFWA member or not. So keep an eye out for that if you're looking for a collaboration agreement. Okay, so you've decided you're going to collaborate. And obviously, the easiest way to collaborate, as I've already said, is connected stories. You know, a shared world can be challenging to build. You may not want to jump into that the first go. So maybe you connect your stories. For example, you have a matchmaker, and each of the matchmaker sets up one set of characters, and that's author A's story, and the matchmaker sets up another set of stories, and that's author Two's stories, and so forth and so on. You could do that, and once the origin is done, all you have to collaborate on is the matchmaker and what he or she is doing, and then everybody's story diverges from there. That's one of the simplest ways to do it. Or, if you're in the thriller world, a weapons dealer. First customer gets a blaster, second one gets a plasma cannon, third one gets an AK-47 variant, and after that, the stories diverge, right? Those are some of the easiest ways to jump into collaborating with other authors. Is let's have this one central pivot point where the matchmaker makes the match, and then it's my story from there. Or in the case of the DNA anthology that I did, the DNA test is the thing. There's the theme. You can do the theme with the DNA test or the mistletoe or whatever, or you can do something like you set up a central character or a central situation like this store, this weapons dealer, this matchmaker, and you will all agree on what the weapons maker or matchmaker looks like, and what the store looks like, and what happens, where you walk in from and where you walk out from. And then from there, the stories diverge and are completely their own thing. That's one of the easiest ways to set up an anthology and a collaboration to see if it'll even work with this group of people. So a little harder is building a brave new world. Building a brave new world takes a lot of time. That whole universe of Outcast Station, it took us about 6 months of solid work, being on the phone 2 or 3 hours every Saturday to build the world to the point where we felt like we could write the stories. So you got to plan out some time for that. You want to deliver a novel in March of next year, you better start right now planning that world. And it's not just worlds like Outcast Station. You could be creating a small town, coastal, Pacific Northwest town in which to set all of your stories, whether they're mysteries or they're suspense or they're romance. You just decide you're going to create a town. You're not going to use an existing town. Well, you have to build that town. You have to decide, is it a mayor and a council? Is there a sheriff, or is it just the police department? How does a sheriff work in a small town? How does a police department work in a small town? You have to think about those things. Is it our world with additions, like it's our world, but it's an urban fantasy, so there's magic sort of underlying everything, or aliens are here? Or is it our world that's gone through an apocalypse or some sort of crisis? That's really hard to write right now, by the way. I was in the middle of writing a space plague book when the pandemic hit, and now that book is on the shelf. I'd already hit 120,000 words on that one. It's really sad. So then, like I said, is it our real world, but you're creating your own town? All of these things you sort of decide, and then you have to go and decide. Beverly Jenkins is a great example of, she created this town. Blessings is a town, and she created everything in it. The town hall and the diner and the streets that go here and the streets that are residential, and where the ice cream shop is. So you don't always think about world building in terms of that sort of thing, but it is world building. And most of the things you have to think about, you can write these down or not. You don't have to. I'm going to give you a link to somebody who wrote the best guide for world building absolutely ever at the end. So you have to decide where it is. Is it in the Pacific Northwest? Is it in the coastal New England? Is it in the deep South? Is it on a planet? Is it on a space station? Is it on the USS Nimitz? Where's your world? When is it? Is it 1940? Is it 2075? Is it 2575? Who are your characters? Is your character the sheriff? Well, then you need to do a little research about what sheriffs are like versus police chiefs, because they're different. How are we going about this story? Is it a suspense? Those are the hows. The rules of the world. If you're doing something with magic or you're doing something with aliens, you need to sit down and figure out the rules. especially if it's magic, you want to make sure that you set up the rules of your magic, how it works, when it works, why it works, and don't break them. What are the regulations? If you're setting up an imaginary world, if you're setting up aliens in our world, do we know? Or are you setting up a future situation where they walk among us freely? What are the regulations? And when and how are you going to change it? How are you going to allow changes? So these are all things you have to consider right up front. Now, some of us start writing and then go, oh crap, I have to figure this out. So do not feel alone if you are the person who's already halfway through a novel going, oh crap, I got to figure this out. Because I cannot tell you. Done it a lot. In this story, as a matter of fact, this is the one where I got the story 3/4 written and went, ooh, I better set up some rules because I'm going to write more than one story in this series and I better know what my rules are. So this is an urban fantasy in this world, in the DC area, but it has magic and it has aliens. So I had to set up, what are the rules for the interactions? What are the rules for getting down here without being seen? What are the rules for the magic? Who knows about it? Where you're setting up the story, again, if you're like me and you just dive right in and suddenly you find yourself in another world or an urban fantasy world or our world after an apocalypse, you're going to write for a while and then you're going to get stuck. Been there, done that. At that point, you can sit down and go, okay, here are the rules. Here are the things I need to do. If it's an alternate history, the time travel, the imaginary city or town, I'm stuck for this reason. It's because I didn't set up the rules. I didn't decide when, where, and how. I've also written a story where I started it in 1940 and ended up realizing that I couldn't write it in 1940. I had to write it in current day because none of the things I wanted to do would work in 1940. So sometimes you've wasted a lot of words and a lot of pages if you don't sort of think about this stuff up front. So the when, you have to think about when you want to set the story. Does it take place in 1692, 2060, like the JD Robb books, a complete alternative 2020, which we all wish we could create, 1984, like Wonder Woman. What season is it? I cannot tell you how many times I've read a story that is either post-apocryphal or it's a suspense story, or I have no idea what time of year it is. Or I've also read it where they created this whole world and the world started in spring and in the next chapter it's fall, but there really wasn't a transition. It's like the next day and suddenly there are fall leaves. That's a good thing to think about right up front. You could be writing it during the crossing of the Atlantic on the Santa Maria. Well, we don't have records for that time. But if you're going to set your story on a cruise ship in the Atlantic in 1984, you better look up and find out whether or not there was a hurricane then, because there'll be somebody reading that book who was alive during that hurricane and knows it. So setting up the when is very important, and the rules for the when. If you're creating an alternate timeline, what changed? So in the 1632 stories that Eric Flint writes, there's a major shifted change in 1632. So one of the challenges for writing in his world, or for Eric Flint himself as a writer creating in this world, is these events happen differently in 1632. So how does that affect our timeline that didn't have this shift? All these other things took place. So what didn't take place because of this shift in 1632? If you get a chance to read any of the 1632 books, incredibly creative as to what they shifted and what they didn't. If you're doing an alternate timeline, then you need to see what were the high points in like the 1990s and what didn't happen because I shifted this. That's what I'm getting at. Misty Lackey and Larry Dixon wrote this whole Serrated Edge series where it's an urban fantasy and the hot rods that drive the streets are all built by elves. I put the opera on station at the penitentiary during a riot. It's just about when. And so where and then twin are you in that space, right? So then who? Are you creating humans in a normal world like Blessings? It's just their world, a small town. You may have created the town out of your imagination, but it operates by all the current rules and nothing is different. Or are you creating Brigadoon, where those people only appear every 100 years? If you're writing aliens, are we visiting their world, or are they in our world visiting us? Do people know, or do they not know? Charlie Cochet's fabulous series with cat changelings. The thirds all are cat changeling who are the law enforcement for the changeling community. Well, there are rules for that. Who does that? All of that world building had to set up. And most of the examples I'm using in here, all of the examples I'm using in here, are great examples of an author who's built a world that's believable. And if you want to read some world building that's really superior, some of the examples that I'm using, and I'll give some more at the end, of where people have seamlessly created worlds. If you're going to do something like this, I suggest you do some reading of those things just to sort of see what people have done and how they've done it. You could be creating a world like Animal Farm or Redwall or Nim, where the animals are the hero and heroine. Again, you better figure out where you are, when you are, and who's doing what, and what the rules are. There's also, with magic, you've absolutely got to figure out, how does it work and how is it countered? If you're building a world with magic, what's the cost? What's the cost of doing magic? Because magic always has to have a cost. Otherwise, it's like, Superman, there's no kryptonite. Just rule the world, right? If any of you have seen Man in the High Castle, the Nazis winning, pretty grim thought, right? Well, they really had to change the rules and look at what would have happened still if the Nazis won and what wouldn't have happened. And there are some places where I really disagreed with what they thought would still happen, but in the most part, it was fairly chilling to see what did or did not happen. Obviously, you can do an apocalypse or an alternate reality. And again, you have to figure out who's doing the acting and what the rules are. How are they doing it? How does space flight work? What form of government is there? Is winter coming? What controls the populace? Is it a pre-industrial world and it's serfs and a fiefdom? Is it a king? Is it an emperor? Is it an empire with where there may be an emperor, but the bureaucrats run everything? Or is the emperor the final word? What's the religion? What's the point of the story? Are they overthrowing the government? Are they, you're establishing this world, but you're trying to overthrow it with this? Social behaviors and mores. Anybody who's ever written or read a Regency historical, or one set in the Victorian era, there were very strict social rules in place about what you could do and what you couldn't do. And how is that going to affect your story? If you're going to change it so it's like 90210 in Regency times, you're changing the rules. And so you need to be aware that if you change those rules, that has to go all the way through your story, and it has to stay all the way through your story. What kind of ceremonies are there? What gods and goddesses are there? When you're looking at creating a world, you have to also look at the rules and regulations. What's the rules of engagement? You can't fire first. If you're this particular kind of soldier, you can't fire first. If you're this kind of time traveler, you have to obey the prime directive. If you're a space traveler, what's your rule of commerce? The upper class only buys via servants. I've seen that done. D.B. Jackson's Times Children's series is a time travel series, one of the best I've ever read, because he actually, although it's set in a mythical world, pre-industrial mythical world, he thought through a lot of the conundrums that trip up most authors when they're writing time travels. Nancy Northcott's Boar King's Honor is another time travel that's done all the rules and regulations really, really well. So it's logical and seamless and believable. Again, I mentioned this earlier. What are the rules for magic? If you draw your power from blood magic, how much do you have to have? If you draw your power from the force, when does it fail? If you draw your power from a god or a goddess, how much can you draw before you die? If you're writing a urban fantasy, who knows about the aliens? Just the hero? Or the hero and somebody else? If you're writing a superhero, who knows? Detective, the Detective Gordon, or what is he, Chief Gordon in Batman, he knows who Bruce Wayne is. Who else does? What are the rules for life and death? For those of you, of course, who've been to my body disposal class, we as a society have different rules for life and death than, say, someone who lives in India. We have different rules for life and death than we did in Victorian times. And if you're killing people off, which, as many of you who've read my books know, I'm very fond of doing, no matter the timeline, you kind of need to know what the rule is. What are the consequences for breaking the law? If you set up a law, what's the consequence? A slap on the wrist, drawn and quartered, firing squad, running from a pack of wolves? I mean, what's the consequence? In The Outstretched Shadow, the very first part of the book, the hero is banished and has to run from a pack of stone wolves. That's his consequence for breaking the law. Well, she set it up that way, or they set it up, she and Mallory set it up that way. And they had to, another situation where somebody broke the law and they were absolutely on point and used it. In Time's Children, what are the consequences for traveling through time? D.B. Jackson, who also writes, his name is David Coe and he writes as D.B. Jackson. In Time's Children, there's a significant consequence for time traveling. Significant. Killer. And so he does not at any point allow anyone to skirt that consequence, even if it means you may not be alive to face, the success that you had. So you have to decide as the author, what are the consequences for the world you're setting up? What's the consequences for the main theme, the magic, the aliens, we're in the Nimitz in the middle of nowhere and we've just seen a spaceship. What are the rules? If any of you ever saw the movie Battleship, which everybody kind of rolls their eyes about, one of the biggest problems with that movie is they set up some rules in the very first part and then they don't follow them. So it's very important to kind of follow the rules that you set up. Like I said earlier, one of the most important things is if you set a rule, don't break it. If kryptonite weakens Superman, don't have him be okay in the face of kryptonite at any point. If you set that magic is only if you're accompanied by a dragon, don't do magic unless that's the point of the story, that this is the first person to be able to do magic without being accompanied by a dragon. Don't break the rule. The other thing is make a story Bible. Even if you think that you're only going to write this one story in this world, with this idea, make a story Bible. The few times that I have not, which Slip Traveler was my learning book on this, I didn't make a story Bible. Now I have 3 other books planned in that series, and I have to go back and read every page of that manuscript slowly and make a story Bible of what I said the rules were and what I named people and what color their hair was. I got it all right within the book, but you've got to make sure that you do it right in the second book and the third book and the fourth book. you've got to remember geography and government and religion and all these things you set up. And one of the best ways to do that is with a story Bible. Now you can do it in Word. A lot of people recommend Scrivener for this. I don't use Scrivener because I don't have space in my brain for one more thing to learn, and there's a big learning curve on Scrivener. I use Excel spreadsheets because then I can move stuff around. And I have one for pretty much everything: geography, government, religion. Don't create a mountain range in Kansas because there isn't one. Don't create a city with marshes if you're in the middle of Arizona. You know, there are things that you have to look up, things you have to make sure of unless you're creating a whole new world. But geography trips up a lot of authors. I don't know if you all know this or not, but there have been tons and tons of books I've read where I'm from a place, I'm from North Carolina, I've lived in Georgia, I've lived in Ohio, and people write something, you're like, no, it's not that way in Ohio. So making a story Bible and checking these things really, really important. And like I said, I've done it in Word, but it's harder to move things around in Word. So I find Excel the best thing for story Bibles. Now we come to the fun part, which I will tell you, the most comprehensive world building questionnaire out there when you're building a world is Patricia Reedy's Fantasy World Building Questions. It covers everything from government to religion to topography to, you know, ceremonies to holidays, you name it, she thought of it. It is free on her website. It's www.pcreedy.com/fantasy-worldbuilding-questions, or just Google Patricia Reedy World Building Questions and you will find it. When Nancy and I did Outcast Station, we created as much as we could create, and then we went to the world building questions to see what we'd missed. We created what we thought we needed, and then we figured out what we needed but we hadn't thought of. So no matter how you do it, whether you do it, just start writing the story and then backtrack and look and see what things you might need by using the questionnaire that she's put together. It's a great, great resource and 100% free. Also, I have a board on my Pinterest page that's collaborations and world building. And I've pinned some things that list some thoughts about world building and collaboration, some lists that authors have put together about what you need to think of. And again, some of those are absolutely great. None of them are as comprehensive as Patricia Reedy's world building questionnaire is on her website. So last but not least is read books who've created great worlds. When Nancy and I were going to do the Outcast Station, and also when we were thinking about doing Canham Castle, she and I both started tossing around, well, what's a world that you've read where it was just seamless and you didn't have that knee-jerk moment where you went, they would do that in this world where you've set this up? Not so sure. So we decided to toss out a list of things where people had done great world building. I will give you one of the best world builders I have absolutely ever read is Nalini Singh. She has created 2 separate worlds, the Archangel's Wars book, which starts with Angel's Blood, and has, I think, 8 or 9 books in it, maybe 12. Brilliant world. It is essentially our world, but with angels. And she has created that so seamlessly and so believably. It's brilliant. She also used our world as the basis for her Psi Changeling series. In the Psi Changeling series, which starts with Slave to Sensation, there are 3 basic types of humans. There are humans that have psionic capabilities, mental, capabilities of some kind. There are changelings, and then there are regular humans who don't have any magic, any power, any psi ability or shifter ability. And the dynamics between those 3 cultures is really brilliantly done. Alona Andrews, who I mentioned before, that's a writing team, a husband-wife writing team, Gordon and Alona Andrews. Their Kate Daniels series is set in a post-apocryphal Atlanta, where magic has returned to the world in a major blast. And sometimes things work with electricity and sometimes they don't. And then she also set up another world, the Hidden Legacy world, where it's Houston, and it's Houston like we would know it. But magic started in the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s. They created a serum that gave everybody magic. And again, brilliant world building. Steve Berry's Cotton Malone series, where his bookstore owner, Cotton Malone, who's a retired analyst and spy, gets involved in all sorts of mischief. And Steve has set up a brilliant world there. And all of them are thrillers. All of them stick with the world, and everything stays on point. Morgan Bryce's Male Romance in the Witchbane series, almost all of her books, both her Gail Martin books and her Morgan Bryce books, which are the Morgan Bryce books, are all male romance. They sort of interact in places where the characters from one refer to the characters in the other. Brilliant world building there, where there's magic and there's root workers and things actually, when you cast a spell, most people could cast it and nothing would happen, but sometimes somebody does and bad things happen. Obviously, Lord of the Rings, if you're a modern reader, where most modern authors jump into the story, immediate action right off the bat. Obviously, for those of you who have read it, Lord of the Rings does not do that, but there could not be more amazing world building than Lord of the Rings. But if you don't want to take the time that it takes to read Lord of the Rings, these other ones are a better choice. D.B. Jackson, I mentioned him earlier with his Times Children's series. Another series he wrote is the Thief Taker series. And it is set in colonial America, and it is one of the best creations of a colonial America world I have ever read in my life. I am a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. I have revolutionary ancestors. I've read a lot about the period because I do genealogy research. It is like walking into the past to read D.B. Jackson's Thief Takers. You walk into a colonial town and you live there for the entire book, and it is brilliant. Those of you who know JD Robb writes slightly futuristic. 2060 is I think the latest one is set in 2061. But her series starts with Naked and Death, and the world building there, again, really spot on. And all of these books have the benefit of having done the job well. So if you're considering creating a big world, creating a space opera, writing a 7-book arc in a post-industrial universe, these are some things you could read to sort of get the feel and the rhythm of how people build a world successfully. Every one of these, I don't think Morgan Bryce, that Gail Martin has hit the New York Times bestseller list with her Morgan Bryce stuff yet, but with her Gail Martin stuff she has. Because they've built the world so well, you're drawn in, you're a part of that world for the term of the book. We as authors, that's what we all want. And so some of these things I've been talking about, those are ways in which you make sure the reader comes into your world and wants to stay there, isn't pulled out because there's kryptonite that works one time and doesn't work another time. So obviously, as I said, my Pinterest board, the collaboration and world building, Pinterest in general, if you just put in world building, has some wonderful resources. SIFWA.org, as I mentioned before, their world building and collaboration agreement things, I think that they're up, but if they're not, they will be soon, because their legacy project is working on how to make sure people take care of intellectual property. And but as I said, the best ever, I'll put her address up again, web address up again here, the Fantasy World Building Questions from Patricia Reedy. Let's go to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeannie. I've been learning a lot and really appreciating it all. Let's see, we do have a question here on world building. How far into the future do things have to be realistic technology-wise?
Well, it depends on what you want to do with it. If you want to create a world where cell phones don't exist and we all have, an ocular implant, Google's working on that. So you wouldn't have to go too far in the future for something like that. But we don't know yet. Will that work? Will there be long-term health consequences? So you might want to go 20 years in the future and say they worked out all the bugs and that's how everybody uses their phone now, with blinking an eye and have an ocular implant. With space travel, because NASA's budget has been cut so fiercely, if we're going to actually end up with space travel, you probably better have, we found a derelict spaceship and reverse engineered space drives, or you set it 100 years in the future where we're looking more towards the space program or whatever. I hope that answers the question. I think you have to be careful with technology and be somewhat general about how things develop. Because honestly, if you'd have asked me 30 years ago, would I have a phone that I could carry in my pocket with face recognition? I'm not sure I would have believed that. And the fact that I have all my music in my phone, really? So you can posit something well into the future that seems impossible now, but don't be surprised if the world catches up with your story faster than you thought it would.
That's a great answer. I'm thinking of Nikola Tesla creating various inventions that were 100 years ahead of time. And we have caught up, but anyway, he was ahead of his time. We do have another question here. If religion is not a part of the plot in your story, do you still recommend creating a religious system in the world?
I recommend at least doing something, making some notes, creating something, because think how often we have characters going, oh, for heaven's sake. I mean, people also do damn it with the first word, and they also do, Christ almighty, it's building natural epithets into the world. It's building consequences into the world. Well, you're going to be damned for that. It becomes part of our vernacular conversation, even if we are not particularly religious. I mean, I've heard people in conversation, especially around this time of year, it's all, all about the pagan Halloween thing, right? Well, if there was no Christianity, that would just be our norm. But because there's Christianity, paganism is a prop to that, like they're mirror to that. So in your world, the only reason, if you're not particularly using it specifically, the only reason to consider creating it, even if you never use it particularly, is for epithets or for the things that people say as cursing, or for the kind of vernacular you use when you say, well, that's a damn shame, or any of that kind of thing that we use in vernacular conversation that, whether we know it or not, or think about it or not, refers to the way in which we see the world as faithful humans, as people who are spiritual. Even if you create it so that the world doesn't have any religion, then you've got to make sure that you are editing your manuscript for references that you use in vocabulary that refer to our religion. I read a book, beautiful world building, up to the point where it was not connected to our world. It was a post-industrial, it was a post-apocalyptic kind of world, but not our world. It was another world. Except 3 of the characters at various points in the story went, Jesus Christ. Well, If it's a post-industrial world that is not Earth, why would you use that as an epithet? That person wouldn't have existed. Well, what did that do? It pulled me right out of the story and made me go, what? Why'd you do that? So I'm not immersed in the story. I'm not turning the page. So even if you're not using it, it's good to give it a thought or two, or make sure you're doing a find replace on your manuscript to see if you've used the word damn. Because to damn, D-A-M-N, is to send someone to hell. If you're not using Christian religion and there isn't a fiery hell, then that word has no value in your world. So those are the kind of things you have to think about. That's why it's part of the world building questionnaire, is because it's sort of a framework that we as writers already assume, because we're writing in our world that has those things. And so if you're writing in a different world, especially, you need to think about it just enough sometimes to make sure that you're not damning people to a fiery hell when there isn't one.
That's great. Thank you. We have another question here. What about a character that travels to the future that speaks an ancient language? The current time characters might speak a modern version. How particular do you think a writer would need to be about understanding that character? I mean, would it be believable that the modern character may be able to understand with some work?
I think you would have to make the transition logical from, wow, I have no idea what those people are saying, to, okay, I'm catching a word every other word, I'm catching a few words here, and finding facility with it, or finding some way to give them facility with language. You have to make the progression logical. Some people do it with like a time skip, that somebody had been there 6 months and finally they figured out how the language had evolved. Or some people have done it with, you know, they spent 12 intensive hours with a teacher and figured it out. You do have to be a little careful with it, because, like, for instance, if you're doing future, like the question indicated, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to read Middle English. You'll find a word or two you recognize that hasn't changed. The word said, the word the, those things don't change. You recognize them. But vernacular conversation, way different. It is almost like a foreign language. If you know Latin at all, you can figure out a lot of languages in the present, because many of them are based on Latin. But if you were coming to the future from ancient Rome, English would probably confuse the ever-living fire out of you, because English comes from Germanic and Latin traditions, and we're completely insane about our homophones and all that sort of thing. But that person coming from ancient Rome would be able to adapt, because there is enough Latin in all of it that if they sat down with somebody in an intensive study to bring them up to the speed on the language, they could probably do it pretty easily if they were a scholar and, you know, could learn language easily. But you do have to have a transition of some kind, because the reader's not going to believe that Joe Smith coming from 21st century America and dropping in to 2155 is going to be able to speak with everybody with facility. So you have to have some kind of transition. And this is one of the problems in space opera and that sort of thing. You sort of have to explain how everybody understands each other, either with translators or that sort of universal translators or that kind of thing. Or you have C3PO.
I remember in the Robert Heinlein movie or novel, Glory Road, he was a human going to another planet, and a character on that planet had him take a nap, and she, you know, sort of like teleporting some of the language. He woke up and he understood more of it. Or
well, in
like a language lesson,
in Edgar Rice Burroughs's John Carter of Mars, he spends, I think, 6 or 8 months in the slave pens, not knowing how to say anything, and that's how they translated it. Because by the time he'd spent 8 months in the slave pens, he finally figured out how to speak the language because of necessity, immersion, dropping yourself in and immersing in it.
Right.
So.
Well, thank you, Jeannie. We do have one final comment. Melinda says that this was all very helpful, and she wishes she would have known 2 years ago when she was working on her own book. So
I totally get you, Melinda. One of the reasons I sort of put this together is because there's so much I wish I'd known. And when sometimes, like I said, when you start a story, the story comes to you and you're, 50, 70, 100 pages into it before you think, wait, I just crossed the streams. I just said they did magic this way. And now on page 75, I'm saying, oh man, I got to figure out which way it is. Sometimes it makes your life a lot easier as a writer to sort of think about these things ahead of time. And also, even if the story does come to you like that, if you've considered these questions at least once, it flows a whole lot better, even if you're just a pantser and fly into the story.
well, again, thank you, Jeannie. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I wanted to remind you that this recording will be available at the library's Facebook page, as well as being posted in a day or two on the YouTube page. So you can go back to it. Please share it with others that you whom you think would be interested. I did want to do just a little promo for the library's upcoming Book Lovers Week, and it is going to start Sunday the 20th. And the first program that week will be at 6:30 on Sunday the 20th. It'll be with author Larry Tye, and he wrote the book Demagogue, the life and long shadow of Senator Joe McCarthy. And he'll be interviewed by Brian Frosch, who is the Attorney General for the state of Maryland. So we're really looking forward to kicking off a wonderful Book Lovers Week. So check us out on the library's website. And, thank you, Jeannie, again. And
absolutely, my pleasure. As I told Kelly, I've taught this course in person before, and it's a little challenging to not be able to see all of y'all and get questions and respond to them more personally. But please feel free to email me through my website if you have any questions that you either didn't feel comfortable asking in this format, or that you think of after you're done, or after you've looked at Patricia Reedy's list or some of the Pinterest things. Please feel free to go to my website and email me through there, and I'll be happy to answer if I can.
Great, wonderful. And thanks everyone for attending today.
Thank you, everybody.